Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. Today is Thursday, October 9th, 2025, and it is curious to me how disastrous our most recent presidents have been with our foreign policy. I think back to President George W. Bush, who unfortunately for the United States won 2 terms, and at the end of his second term, he crashed the U.S. economy, and also he was pushing for the inclusion of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. So he strongly backed NATO membership, and at that time didn't see Russia as having the power or ability to detain or slow down that membership push. Um, anyway, he announced that push on April 1st, 2008, and um, uh, President Putin had shown in 2007, when he was president, that Russia was starting to catch on to the aggressive moves of the United States and NATO to move east and become more warlike. So he was strongly opposing U.S. power in the region as destabilizing. And to reply to that, President Bush in 2008 decided it was time to announce that he wanted to have Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. The Georgia push failed, and now we have in Georgia the Georgia Dream, and Georgia Dream is pushing back on the EU, the NGOs, and all these organizations which are trying to carry out regime change and coups and destabilize the society in Georgia. So that's very good. And back in 2008, only 30% of the people in Ukraine supported NATO membership. At that time, Ukraine was still very prosperous. Um, they were happy with their current situation, and despite years of U.S. investment in Ukraine through the USAID, the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and so many other U.S. organizations, which are just camouflaged Pentagon operatives to try to prepare countries to regime change and to doubt the good and the stability of their country and elect the United States as their sole provider for security and prosperity. So anyway, you can see that President Putin in 2007 was catching on clearly in his speech in Munich to the moves of the United States and where they were heading. But at that time, Russia was still recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. So that was almost 20 years after the collapse. And they were still picking up the pieces. So you can see that Russia was focused on stabilizing its society, ridding its society of all these corrupt oligarchs, one of which, like Navalny, would try to come back later to run for office and mysteriously died in prison. I think he was a traitor. So, traitors usually died like Benedict Arnold. So, I think possibly that was the best thing that could happen for Russia. But anyway, when we look at the move of President Trump President Bush trying to push Ukraine into NATO, and 70% of the people opposed that move. It was still too early, but I think that the situation with President Bush at the time was that he saw that Russia was starting to organize. It was starting to get a cohesive society. It was starting to recover militarily. It still wasn't at the point where it could oppose the United States, which at that time still had many soldiers in Iraq, not too far away from Ukraine. So possibly if Russia tried to invade Ukraine to push back on the whole NATO membership. They would have been met by possibly a conflict at that time. So anyway, the Russia decided to bide its time and wait for the right opportunity to try to stop this NATO expansion. That opportunity came after 2014 when there was a coup in Ukraine and removed, which removed the democratically elected government. So anyway, you can see that Russia was still building, building economically, restoring a cohesive society, and you know, building its military. And so anyway, um, President Bush at the time was trying to push as hard as he could because he knew that if he didn't get Ukraine into NATO at this time, more than likely it wouldn't happen. So, needless to say, the coup that took place in Ukraine um, certainly was the result of everything that Bush did to try to change Ukraine. Now we have President Trump in office, and he's trying to look for ways for Ukraine to hold out against the Russian invasion. So he's now talking about tomahawks, which could certainly kick up this conflict into a whole new level. So, anyway, there was one person who was in the Bush administration, and I want to reflect on some of his words, which I think others have mentioned in other videos about the continuity of policy. But anyway, we have this individual, Stephen Hadley, who was the advisor to the National Security Council, and he was heavily involved with President Bush on this Ukraine to NATO push. So anyway, the Stephen Hadley in May of this year, May 2025, received the Distinguished Leadership Award, and which honored leaders who demonstrate the true meaning of bravery and service. So here we have someone who is involved in the Bush administration, one which created massive loss of life in Iraq, and created a fictitious democracy in Iraq in an area called the Green Zone. So anyway, this person, Stephen Hadley, when he received the award, um, uh, delivered some words, and the most important ones that I can pull from this list are the following, noting that there are many U.S. government agencies and departments that work on foreign policy. Hadley emphasized the importance of getting them to coordinate and cooperate toward the same objectives. Good process does not dictate good policy, but good policy is harder to achieve without good process. So anyway, this whole the coordination between all of these different agencies and organizations, what he's talking about is the NGOs. He's talking about the U.S. foreign policy. He's talking about our partners. He's talking about all the assets, and all these organizations like the USAID, NED, National Endowment for Democracy, which are operatives of the U.S. State Department and the Pentagon, and work to focus on achieving the goals of the Pentagon. All these organizations are supposed to be coordinated and move in the same direction and not in different directions, which means that if you have a charitable organization, like a charitable organization that the U.S. government has, that charitable organization doesn't work for the good of the people. It works for the good of the Pentagon or the U.S. State Department. So anyway, for many people, this was the way that they got into governments, and did regime change. We can see in Ukraine the effort to do regime change and the organization of the ultra nationalists who carried out the coup d'etat in 2014 in Ukraine. All this came from years of U.S. Involvement in creating these political social organizing groups and in getting involved in the educational department in Ukraine and getting the people convinced that the Russians were monsters and they had to exterminate them or push them out of their country, and thereby creating an environment in Ukraine that was not um, welcoming to the ethnic Russian people who spoke Russian, who practiced the Orthodox faith. And so, anyway, the main point here is that the result of George W. Bush was widespread death and destruction in many countries. We can think of Iraq and we can think of Afghanistan. President Bush is certainly, President Trump seems to be carrying along the same line as wanting to conserve as much of Ukraine as possible for NATO. And my perception of this conflict is that President Trump wanted to freeze the conflict along the contact line so that basically once the conflict was frozen, he could claim all of what was west of that line for NATO, and then Russia would claim all that was east of that line. So anyway, so it's obvious Russia is not going to stop this war until the martial law regime in Kiev is removed and they are able to put a government in Kiev that will bring prosperity and peace to the country, something that the U.S. government says it's dedicated to, but does the opposite. So anyway, you can see the continuity of policy between Bush and Trump, and even now the economy is starting to falter. So by the end of the Trump presidency, we could see many other elements repeating from the Bush administration, like a stock market collapse, like the collapse in the economy and the housing and many other areas. We're seeing that the farmers are suffering and they're going to get a bailout, but there are other sectors of society that won't be getting any bailout. And so all this effort to try to focus the resources of the United States on controlling all the countries in the planet and doing regime change for the countries who oppose the United States, like they're trying to do in Venezuela, only means greater suffering for this country and great suffering for the countries that the U.S. peace and prosperity train is aimed at. So anyway, that is my report for today, and thank you for joining me. If you like this video, please hit like, and you can subscribe if you like. That will help, and please come back for more videos. So thank you for joining, and have a good day. Bye bye.